So this is from a conference last year. I'm going to try to walk through it quite quickly. I have no pretensions of actually changing anything. I said this in response to what Akshat said before. This is just a horse. Okay. What is the greatest is round. It has no qualities, said Schelling in 1811. This line kind of anticipates the following horror story that begins with Kant's analogy. So in October 1786, Immanuel Kant responds to the ongoing pantheism controversy. He does so by means of an analogy. Orientation in thinking is analogous to orientation in geography, in spatial navigation. In the proper meaning of the word, he says, to orient oneself means to use a given direction when we divide the horizon into four of them, in order to find the others, literally to find the sunrise. But for that, he adds, I also need the feeling of a difference in my own subject, namely the difference between my right and left hands. And crucially, the faculty of making distinctions through the feeling of right and left comes naturally to our aim. It is a faculty implanted by nature, but made habitual through frequent practice. It is based on this concept of orientation that Kant makes the analogy to the case of orientation in thinking. Thus, to orient oneself in thinking in general means when objective principles of reason are insufficient for holding something true, to determine the matter according to a subjective principle, just like one did in the case of orientation in physical space. But to orient oneself according to subjective principle is to transpose a geographical concept of orientation with a natural ground of a felt need to the case of a logical principle. The analogy thus traces a model of thought's good conduct from manipulations of a determinate body navigating a space divided into cardinal directions according to custom. The concept of orientation evokes a strange kind of isomorphism between terrestrial space and the proper behavior of thought. Let us take this connection as the starting point for a speculative anthropology that examines beliefs across evolutionary biology, cultural history, and formal images of thought. So 2, logic and the original concept of orientation. Some 200 years after Kant, the time-space sociologist Bernd Schmeikal proposes a peculiar kind of hypothesis. The 16 truth functions of the n equals 2 table of Boolean logic could be derived from the structure of an original concept of orientation in space. He illustrates this with interpretations of cultural history, one of which is a quadripartite stone plate whose different rotations correspond to the different truth functions. They look like this. So the things on the right, basically you can flip them to each and turn them, and each flip corresponds to one function. So there are 16, essentially. Schmeikal's speculative conclusion is that logic could plausibly have been learned or developed from an understanding of orientation in space that is incidentally kind of isomorphic to Kant's previous concept. So, anatomy and the negative freedom of thought then. So the Kantian upshot of Schmeikal's conclusion is that one does not need recourse to any external object to derive logic from space. In virtue of its basic symmetry, the bilateral body already constitutes a diagram of the rules of reasoning. So the stone corresponds basically to how our body has its symmetry given to it. By rotating our own bodies in the cardinal directions of terrestrial space, we can think of ourselves as expressing logical operations. With this in mind, one may even think that kind of neurogenesis of thought is guided by bodily symmetry, impacting the cultural acquisition and development of logical practices over time. Taken to its farthest extent, we might even trace a speculative and a cultural and natural history to ground and validate Kant's analogy from the advent of the bilateral clade some 550 million years ago prior to the present. Despite the existence of other types of logic, it is then plausible that they are subject to ergonomic factors, such as that thinkable logics are enabled by their ancestral bodily constraints, say. We find ourselves thus in the midst of an evolutionary process where bodily symmetry forms the bedrock of nascent thought with intermediary of experience. The thinkable is thinkable in virtue of its symmetrical substrates. Let us entertain this as a kind of postulate with universal validity. Thought follows orientation in space, follows symmetry of the body. Now, consider such constraints in the, on what's thinkable, or sort of how thought operates in the language of negative freedom, that is, freedom from external restraints, which in this case have been imposed on thinking throughout evolutionary developmental history. The body has become a limiting factor on our image of an autonomous thought, one which cannot be delimited from outside, since we, as thinkers, are deeply embedded in it ourselves. We cannot think outside of the thought that we possess, that has been given to us from the constraints of our bodily form. Turning against these constraints on the thinkable would be to turn against some of the most entrenched constraints there are then. But history is not over. We're still evolving. So let's try for a thought experiment, a game of developmental lockpicking. So here we have the components: a normative demand for thought to acquiesce to, in addition to a natural history of its acquiescence to the body, that is, to create a little kind of expose. Let us imagine a future culture that, taking the aforementioned beliefs seriously, wants to maximize its degree of negative freedom of thought inside nature. What this means in practice is a project to deliberately and fundamentally remodel the human phenotype, focusing on its symmetry, since that is what conditions thought. Such a project can perhaps be understood through Wimsatt and Shank's developmental lock model, which they formulated in 1986, where in developmental systems such as animal kind of ontogenic upstream determinations are more constraining than their downstream dependence. So, for instance, a mutation impacting the basic development of the spine is very unlikely to result in reproductively viable offspring, whereas a missing toe is probably less disastrous or deleterious. So on a phylogenetic level, developmental locks are conservative, limiting the number of viable evolutionary trajectories at any given time. Developmental locks limit the range of adaptive mutations and kind of explain from Bayer's laws according to which evolution tends to proceed from the general to the specific. Like this, first from a, yeah, I think it makes sense. We have arms, then we have fingers in kind of evolutionary time, yeah. And also in how an embryo develops. Okay, so to liberate thought from its entrenched constraints, ethicists of our future culture will need to conceive of a project to unlock their species' basic morphology, as bilateral symmetry has become entrenched over 500 million years. So they construe their project as a game of developmental lockpicking. The developmental lock model allows the players to disregard the distinction between innate and acquired and consider their own morphology from the point of view of a kind of pure entrenchment of features. It means it's an iterative, to kind of achieve this project is an iterative modification of an environmental pathway that's capable of reorienting our evolutionary trajectory. The end is a new corporeal symmetry. Beginning with weakly entrenched and traits, the environment is gradually modified to select for a new adaptive picture that removes downstream dependencies gradually from their upstream determinants. Rinse and repeat, and repeat, and repeat. First the fingers go, then the arms, until we go back to I don't know what. As the project proceeds, slowly and with good fortune, hopefully, even the most thoroughly entrenched determinations will, according to the proponents of the game, prove tractable. And we can sort of begin to form a new shape for ourselves. But in nature, freedom of thought must remain constrained by some corporeal form. We cannot be formless. Is there a maximum? So the theorem then is that maximizing negative freedom in nature means to become adapted not to all environments at all, but to none. Through the gradual elimination of evolutionary constraints, such as planetary gravitational influence, the players seek a stable symmetry on which environmental constraints approach zero. This will yield the maximum freedom of thought. The game of developmental lockpicking thus orients human evolution towards the renunciation of orientation and its hold on thought. The intended result is the perfect form, adapted to the void, forever unchanging. And so, to reach the apex of liberty in nature, our players will strive to become homosphere, the human noospheres. The human noosphere is the result of a thought turning against its own constraints within the bounds of nature. Homosphere is the annihilation of nihilism by nihilism and of orientation by orientation. Due to its intrinsic structure, spherical symmetry will yield an apex of freedom according to our guiding postulates. Extragalactic solipsism is therefore an inescapable attractor in eugenics, a stable state for maximally free thought in the void between galaxies. As for Bilaterians, homosphere is a study in deriving implications from speculative anthropology. This is a project that could actually be attempted, particularly with a cultural attitude kind of intent on turning evolutionary pathways into the proper domain of ethics, which seems dubious. We cannot be perfect, the proponent would say, unless we are round. Okay, some more information and kind of the background for this fiction. I'm gonna stop sharing if I can figure it out. Thank you for listening.